Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest and where the men's society has written off become the most dangerous players in the game. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments, whether you're wrapped in blankets in London at midnight, driving through empty Texas highways at sunset, or stealing a quiet moment in Melbourne before dawn. I want to know, because tonight's story is for everyone who has ever been underestimated, everyone who has ever been dismissed, everyone who has ever sat in silence while cruel people laughed in their face and thought, just wait. Your time is coming. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on our latest story. Let me tell you something the history books don't emphasize enough. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, a man named Henry Paget, the Earl of Uxbridge, was riding beside the Duke of Wellington when a cannonball shattered his right leg. According to legend, he looked down at the mangled limb and said, quite calmly, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." Wellington glanced over and replied, "By God, sir, so you have." That man, one leg, as society would later call him, did not crawl into a corner and die. He had his leg amputated without anesthesia, was fitted with a revolutionary prosthetic that would bear his name, and went on to become one of the most powerful men in England, Field Marshal, Knight of the Garter, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland twice. He lived another 39 years, and every single one of them was a testament to the truth that society's judgment means nothing in the face of iron will. Lord Nelson commanded the British fleet at Trafalgar, blind in one eye and missing his right arm. Lord Fitzroy Somerset lost his arm at Waterloo and went on to command armies. These men understood something that the glittering aristocrats in their ballrooms never could: disability is not defeat. It is camouflage. It is armor. It is the last thing your enemies see before you destroy them. And tonight's story is about a duke who understood that lesson better than anyone who came before him. A man who let the world believe he was broken, shattered, finished. A man confined to a wheelchair, dependent on servants, pitted by the very enemies who had orchestrated the explosion that nearly killed him. They called him the Crippled Duke. They whispered that his mind had shattered along with his spine. They laughed behind their fans and congratulated themselves on their victory. They patted his shoulder like he was a child and spoke slowly, as if his ears had failed along with his legs. They had no idea he was watching. Listening. Planning. Writing down every name, every slight, every moment of cruelty in a ledger that would one day come due. And on his wedding night, when his new bride, a woman sold to him for £40,000 to save her worthless family, expected nothing but duty from a broken man, Adams Foster did the unthinkable. He rose from that wheelchair, crossed the room on two steady legs, and whispered the words that would bring an empire of corruption crashing down. Now they'll all pay. Let me take you back to the spring of 1847, to a crumbling townhouse in Mayfair, where a young woman named Sherry Irene was about to discover that the most dangerous predators are the ones who let you believe they can't hunt. The Ashworth Ball was exactly the kind of suffocating spectacle Sherry Irene had learned to despise. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across a sea of silk and jewels, while the orchestra sawed through a waltz that nobody was actually dancing to because everyone was too busy cataloging who was wearing what, who was standing with whom, and who had the audacity to show their face after last week's scandal. The air smelled of hothouse roses, expensive perfume, and the particular tang of aristocratic judgment. Sherry Irene stood near the terrace doors in a gown her mother had commissioned before the money ran out, pale blue silk that had been let out twice and still pinched at the waist, and watched the glittering predators circle each other with champagne flutes and poison smiles. She had been engaged to the Duke of Foxworth for exactly 8 days. 8 days, and already the whispers followed her like a shadow. Poor girl, she'd heard Lady Pemberton murmur behind her fan not 10 minutes ago. Sold to that creature like a breeding mare. I give the marriage 6 months before she smothers him with a pillow. Sherry Irene had smiled and sipped her champagne and imagined very clearly what it would feel like to dump the entire contents of the punch bowl over Lady Pemberton's elaborately powdered wig. Then the crowd near the entrance shifted, and she saw him for the first time. The Duke of Foxworth arrived in a wheeled chair pushed by a stone-faced valet, and the effect on the ballroom was immediate. Conversation stuttered. Heads turned. Someone's champagne flute hit the floor with a crystalline crash that nobody bothered to acknowledge because they were all too busy staring at the broken Duke who had dared to show his face in society. Sherry Irene's first thought was that he didn't look like a vegetable. Her second thought was that he was beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are, dark hair swept back from a face too sharp and angular to be kind, eyes the color of winter storms, and a mouth set in a line that suggested he knew exactly what everyone in this room thought of him and found it mildly amusing. He was younger than she'd expected. No more than 30. And there was something in the way he held himself, perfectly still, perfectly composed, that made her think of a loaded pistol. The valet wheeled him toward the refreshment table, and the crowd parted like he was carrying plague. Sherry Irene watched Lady Ashworth, their hostess, a woman who prided herself on her Christian charity, visibly flinch as the wheelchair passed within 5 feet of her. "Good God," drawled a voice to Sherry Irene's left. She turned to find Lord Manton, a red-faced earl with a reputation for gambling and worse. He was smirking at the Duke with the kind of cruelty that men like him wore like a badge of honor. "I didn't think Foxworth still made public appearances. Thought they kept him locked in the attic like a mad dog." His companion, Sir Reginald Blackwood, a man with eyes like a snake, laughed into his whiskey. "Probably wanted one last look at society before the wedding. Can't blame him. Once he's leg-shackled to that Irene girl, she'll have him committed within the month and take the estate for herself. Assuming he can even consummate the marriage," Manton said, loud enough that several people turned to listen. "I heard he can't control his own bowels, let alone anything else." The laughter that followed was like broken glass. Sherry Irene felt something cold and sharp slide through her chest. Not embarrassment. Not even anger. Something harder. Something that tasted like iron and felt like a decision being made. She set down her champagne flute, smoothed her skirts, and walked directly across the ballroom floor toward the Duke of Foxworth. The crowd went silent. Adams Foster looked up as she approached, and for just a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in those storm-gray eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or calculation. Then his face went slack again, that empty mask that everyone expected from the crippled Duke. But Sherry Irene had seen it. That flash of intelligence. That razor-sharp awareness. He wasn't broken at all. She dropped into a curtsy that would have made her deportment teacher weep with pride. "Your Grace," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I believe we haven't been formally introduced. I'm Sherry Irene, your betrothed." She straightened and extended her hand, palm down, exactly as protocol demanded. Behind her, she heard Lord Manton choke on his whiskey. The Duke stared at her hand for a long moment. His own hands rested on the arms of his wheelchair, perfectly still. Then, slowly, he reached up and took her fingers in his. His grip was warm. Steady. Strong enough that she felt the calluses on his palm, not the hands of an invalid at all, but the hands of a man who did things with them. "Miss Irene," he said, and his voice was a low rasp, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. Or as if he was pretending he hadn't. The pleasure is entirely mine. She smiled at him. Not the brittle society smile she'd been wearing all evening, but something real. Something sharp. I look forward to our wedding, Your Grace. I think we're going to do remarkable things together. His fingers tightened on hers for just a heartbeat. And there it was again. That flicker of something deadly and alive behind the vacant mask. Remarkable, he repeated softly, and released her hand. Yes. I believe we will. Sherry Irene turned back toward the crowd and found every eye in the ballroom fixed on her. Lady Pemberton looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. Lord Manton's face had gone purple. And Sir Reginald Blackwood was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something calculating and cold. She picked up a glass of champagne from a passing footman's tray, raised it in a silent toast to the room, and drank it down in one long swallow. Let them talk. Let them whisper. Let them think she was a fool for defending a broken duke. They had no idea what was coming. Neither did she, for that matter. But as she glanced back at Adams Foster, at the way his eyes tracked her across the ballroom with the focus of a predator, she realized with a strange thrill of recognition that her life had just become far more dangerous than a simple transaction to save her family. She'd just caught the attention of the most lethal man in England. And he'd caught hers right back. Sherry Irene escaped to the terrace 20 minutes later, when the stares and whispers became too much even for her newly sharpened defiance. The night air was cold enough to bite through silk, and she welcomed it. Anything was better than the suffocating heat of the ballroom, where every breath tasted like judgment and expensive wine. She was halfway through mentally composing a list of people she'd like to see ruined when she heard the soft click of wheels on stone behind her. You should have worn a shawl, Adams Foster said, his voice still carrying that rasping quality that suggested disuse. It's cold out here. Sherry Irene didn't turn around. Are you offering me yours, Your Grace? I'd hate to see you catch your death before the wedding. The gossips would be so disappointed. They'd survive. They always do. The wheelchair rolled closer, stopping just at the edge of her peripheral vision. That was quite the performance in there. Performance? She finally turned to face him, one eyebrow arched. I was simply greeting my betrothed. I'm told it's customary. You were defending me. His voice was flat, impossible to read. Against Manton and Blackwood. That was either very brave or very stupid. Perhaps both. Sherry Irene crossed her arms against the cold. They were being cruel. I don't tolerate cruelty well. It's one of my many flaws. Is it? Something shifted in his expression, though in the moonlight she couldn't quite tell what. Your father sold you to me for £40,000. I'd think you'd have learned to tolerate all manner of things by now. The words were sharp enough to draw blood, but Sherry Irene had been raised by a coward and educated by creditors. She'd developed thick skin. My father is a spineless wastrel who would sell his own soul if he thought it would cover his gambling debts. What he tolerates and what I tolerate are two very different things. Good, Adams said softly. Then he stood up. It wasn't a slow process. There was no struggle, no theatrical gasping, no trembling limbs. One moment he was sitting in that wheelchair, the broken duke everyone pitied. The next he was standing in front of her, 6 feet of lean muscle and predatory grace, close enough that she could see the sharp intelligence blazing in those winter storm eyes. Sherry Irene's breath caught. She took an involuntary step backward and found her spine pressed against the stone balustrade. You're not, her voice came out barely above a whisper. You're not crippled at all. No. Adams braced one hand on the balustrade beside her head, caging her in. Not threatening, but unmistakably deliberate. I'm not. Haven't been for 3 years. But everyone thinks I am, which makes them stupid and careless and very, very talkative around someone they believe can't understand them. Her mind was racing, cataloging implications like her life depended on it. Because maybe it did. The explosion. The injury. That was real. Real enough. Russian munitions factory, 1842. The blast killed my father and 17 other men. It was supposed to kill me too. His voice was cold now, stripped of that rasping weakness. But I survived. Spent 2 years learning to walk again. And I spent every single day of those 2 years listening to the men who orchestrated that explosion congratulate themselves on their victory. Manton, Sherry Irene breathed. Blackwood. And Ashworth. Lord Thomas Ashworth, our gracious host tonight. Adams smiled, and it was the most dangerous thing Sherry Irene had ever seen. They wanted control of the Foxworth shipping contracts. My father wouldn't sell, so they arranged an accident. A tragic explosion. Poor crippled heir, too damaged to run the business. The estate falls into the hands of appointed trustees. Trustees they control. But you fooled them. I let them think they'd won. I played the broken duke. I drooled. I stared at walls. I let them talk freely around me because who worries about what a vegetable overhears? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something intimate and deadly. And I wrote down every word. Every confession. Every careless boast. 5 years of evidence, Miss Irene. 5 years of their crimes in their own voices. Sherry Irene's heart was hammering against her ribs. Not from fear. From something else entirely. Something that felt like recognition. And now? Now I need a partner. Someone they'll underestimate the same way they underestimated me. Someone who can move through society, gather information, be present in rooms I can't access without breaking my cover. His eyes searched hers. Someone who hates them as much as I do. I don't even know them. Your father does. Your father owes Manton £15,000 in gambling debts that he hasn't told you about. Debts that Manton uses to control him. To control you. Adams's voice was soft, but every word landed like a blade. Manton suggested this marriage to your father. He wants someone inside Foxworth House. Someone to confirm I'm as broken as I appear. Someone to report back on whether I'm genuinely helpless or whether I'm dangerous. The pieces clicked together in her mind, sharp and cold and perfect. He wants me to spy on you. Yes. And I'm asking you to let him think you will. I'm asking you to be exactly what they expect, a bitter, mercenary woman who married for money and title. Let them think you hate me. Let them think you'll betray me. He paused. And then help me destroy every single one of them. Sherry Irene stared at him for a long moment, at this man who'd been pretending to be broken while his enemies danced on his father's grave. This man who just offered her something more valuable than money or title or security. He'd offered her revenge. What do I get out of this? She asked quietly. Adams smiled again, sharp cold and sharp. Freedom. Power. The satisfaction of watching cruel men fall. And a husband who will never, ever underestimate you. He held out his hand, palm up. Do we have an agreement, Miss Irene? She looked at his hand. At the calluses and scars that told the story of a man who'd rebuilt himself from ruins. At the strength hidden beneath 5 years of careful deception. Then she placed her hand in his and felt his fingers close around hers like a promise. "We have an agreement, Your Grace," she said. "Let's burn them all down." Sherry Irene returned to the crumbling townhouse at 3 in the morning to find her father exactly where she'd left him 6 hours earlier, slumped in his study chair with an empty decanter at his elbow and the particular slack-jawed expression of a man who'd drunk himself past consciousness and into something approaching oblivion. Perfect. She closed the door quietly behind her and locked it. The click of the bolts sliding home sounded obscenely loud in the silence, but her father didn't stir. His breathing was heavy and wet, the sound of a man drowning in his own weakness. Sherry Irene crossed to his desk and began opening drawers. She found what she was looking for in the third one down, a leather portfolio stuffed with correspondence, IOUs, and promissory notes written in her father's increasingly desperate handwriting. The dates went back 2 years. The amounts made her stomach turn. £15,000 to Lord Manton. £8,000 to Blackwood. £12,000 to various moneylenders whose names she didn't recognize but whose interest rates were extortionate enough to be criminal. At the very bottom of the pile, she found a letter written in Manton's distinctive scrawl. The paper was expensive, the seal already broken. She held it up to the lamplight and read words that confirmed everything Adams had told her on that terrace. "The marriage to Foxworth will solve both our problems. Your debt's forgiven in exchange for your daughter's placement in his household. She need only confirm his condition and report any signs of competence or awareness. A simple task for an intelligent woman, and one that benefits us all." Sherry Irene set the letter down carefully, precisely, before the rage shaking through her hands could tear it to pieces. They'd planned this. Manton and her father, sitting together over brandy and cigars, had planned to sell her like livestock and turn her into a spy. Her father had looked her in the eye and pretended it was about saving the family when really he'd been saving his own worthless skin. She picked up a pen from the desk and tested its weight. Then she filled a glass with water from the pitcher on the sideboard, walked to her father's chair, and dumped the entire contents over his head. He came awake sputtering and flailing, water streaming down his face into his already stained cravat. "What, Sherry, what in God's name? You're going to write something for me, father." Her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly level. She set the pen down in front of him. "And you're going to sign it?" He blinked at her stupidly, still half drunk, water dripping from his chin. "What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night. It's 3 in the morning, and you're going to write a full confession. Every debt. Every arrangement with Manton. Every instruction he gave you regarding my marriage." Sherry Irene pulled Manton's letter from her pocket and held it up. "I've already found this. But I want it in your handwriting. I want your signature. I want every detail of how you sold me to serve Lord Manton's interests." Her father's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." She leaned down until they were eye to eye, until he could see exactly how much she despised him. "You traded me for your gambling debts. You made me a pawn in Manton's game. And you lied to my face about all of it. So now you're going to write it all down, or I'm going to walk out of this house tonight and you'll never see another penny from the Duke of Foxworth. No £40,000. No debt forgiveness. Nothing. Sherry, please," his voice cracked. "Manton will kill me if he finds out I've confessed." "Then you should have thought about that before you made a deal with him." She straightened, crossing her arms. You have two choices, father. Write the confession and maintain my silence, or refuse and face immediate financial ruin. I'm told debtor's prison is particularly unpleasant this time of year. He stared at her like she was a stranger. Maybe she was. Maybe the girl who'd stood in this study 8 days ago and let him bully her into submission had died on that terrace with Adams Foster. Maybe what stood here now was something harder. Something with teeth. You've changed, her father whispered. I've learned. Sherry Irene pushed the pen closer. Now write. It took him 30 minutes. His hand shook so badly the letters were barely legible, but she made him start over twice until every word was clear. He wrote about Manton's visit 6 months ago. About the offer to forgive his debts in exchange for arranging a marriage to Foxworth. About the instructions to ensure Sherry Irene understood her role as an informant. About the promise that once Adams Foster was confirmed as incompetent, Manton would help orchestrate a legal proceeding to have him committed and the estate transferred to more capable hands. When he was finished, she took the papers and read every line twice. Sign it, she said. This is a death sentence. Only if anyone sees it. Sign it, father. He signed with a hand that trembled so violently the ink splattered across his name. Baron Sinclair, in shaking letters that looked like they'd been written by a man already dead. Sherry Irene blotted the signature carefully, folded the papers, and tucked them into her bodice. Then she looked at the man who'd raised her, this coward, this fool, this creature who'd sold his daughter to save himself, and felt absolutely nothing. The wedding is in 2 weeks, she said quietly. You'll attend. You'll smile. You'll play the proud father giving away his daughter. And you'll never speak to Lord Manton about this conversation or about anything else regarding my marriage. Do you understand? Her father nodded mutely, his face the color of old parchment. Good. Sherry Irene walked to the door and unlocked it. She paused on the threshold and looked back one last time. For what it's worth, father, I hope the brandy was worth it. Because you've lost me forever. She closed the door on his broken sob and walked out into the dawn with her father's confession pressed against her heart like a blade. Adams had asked for a partner who could be dangerous. She'd just proven she could be lethal. The wedding had been exactly as cold and sterile as Sherry Irene had expected. A small chapel, a bored vicar, a handful of witnesses who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Her father had attended with the haunted expression of a man watching his own execution. Adams had played his role perfectly, slack-jawed and vacant, wheeled to the altar like a piece of furniture, barely managing to mumble his vows. The ton would be talking about it for weeks. Poor girl. Married to that creature. What a waste. Let them talk. Now, 6 hours later, Sherry Irene stood in the Duchess's chambers of Foxworth House and stared at the massive 4-poster bed that dominated the room like a dark promise. Her wedding dress had been carefully removed by a silent lady's maid who'd unpinned her hair and left her in a nightgown of such fine silk it felt like wearing moonlight. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across walls lined with burgundy damask and oil paintings of stern-faced Foxworth ancestors who looked like they disapproved of everything, especially joy. She heard the wheelchair before she saw it. The soft whir of wheels on hardwood, growing closer. Then the connecting door between their chambers opened and Adams Foster rolled himself through, still wearing his wedding clothes, still maintaining that empty stare that everyone believed. The door clicked shut behind him. Sherry Irene turned to face him, her pulse quickening despite herself. They were alone now. Truly alone. Man and wife, for better or worse, and she still wasn't entirely certain which this would be. You looked beautiful today, Adam said, and his voice was clear now, stripped of that rasping weakness. Even if you did look like you wanted to stab the vicar. He kept staring at your chair like it might bite him. It was distracting. She crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how thin the silk nightgown was, how the firelight probably made it translucent. Are we going to discuss strategy now, or did you actually come here for the traditional wedding night activities? Because I should warn you, I have no idea what those actually entail beyond the basics. Adams laughed softly. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and the sound did something strange to her chest. I came here, he said, to renegotiate our terms. We already have terms. Partnership. Revenge. Mutual destruction of our enemies. Those were battlefield terms. He rolled forward until he was close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. But we're married now, Sherry Irene. That changes things whether we planned for it or not. So I'm proposing new terms. Ones that account for the fact that we're going to be living in the same house, sleeping in connecting rooms, and spending every day and night in each other's company for the foreseeable future. What kind of terms? Honest ones. Adams braced his hands on the arms of his wheelchair. No more games between us. No more masks when we're alone. I show you who I really am, you show me who you really are, and we build something that can survive what's coming. Because what's coming, Duchess, is going to be brutal. Sherry Irene's breath caught. You want honesty? From both of us? Starting now. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the trap. But all she saw was a man who'd spent 5 years pretending to be broken, asking her to see him as whole. Then show me, she said quietly. Show me who you really are. Adam smiled. Then he stood up. She'd seen him do it once before on that terrace, but somehow this felt different. More deliberate. More revealing. He rose from that wheelchair like a man shedding a coffin, unfolding to his full height with a predator's grace. He was wearing too many layers, the formal wedding coat, waistcoat, cravat, but even through the fabric she could see the lines of muscle built over years of hidden training. He took a step toward her. Then another. Each footfall perfectly balanced, perfectly controlled. The walk of a man who'd rebuilt himself bone by bone and sinew by sinew until he was stronger than he'd ever been before. This is who I am, he said, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Adams Foster. 30 years old. Son of a murdered father. Heir to a fortune that was nearly stolen. A man who has spent the last 5 years cataloging the names of his enemies and planning exactly how to destroy them. He reached up and began loosening his cravat with fingers that were perfectly steady. I don't sleep well. I have nightmares about the explosion. I can be cold and calculating and ruthless when I need to be. And I will never, ever forgive the men who killed my father. The cravat came off. He dropped it on the floor between them like a gauntlet. Your turn, he said softly. Sherry Irene's heart was hammering so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. But she lifted her chin and met his gaze without flinching. Sherry Irene Foster, she said. 23 years old. Daughter of a coward and sister to a wastrel. I'm angry. Furious, actually. At my father for selling me, at the ton for pitying me, at every man who's ever looked at me and seen a commodity instead of a person. She took a step closer to him, close enough that the silk of her nightgown brushed against his waistcoat. I'm smarter than anyone gives me credit for. I can be vicious when cornered. And I will burn down anyone who underestimates me. Adams's eyes darkened. "I know," he said. "I saw you get your father's confession. That was the moment I realized I'd married someone who could actually match me." "Match you?" She tilted her head. "I intend to exceed you, Your Grace." He laughed again, and this time it was full of genuine delight. "God, you're perfect." Then his expression turned serious. "One more term for negotiation. The most important one." "What?" "This marriage. It started as strategy, but it doesn't have to stay that way." He lifted one hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers were warm against her temple. "I'm asking if you want this to be real. Not just the revenge, but the partnership. The life we're building. Us." Sherry Irene's breath stopped. She searched his face and saw the vulnerability there beneath the predator's mask. This man who'd hidden his strength from the world was offering her something he'd never offered anyone else. Truth. "I want it," she whispered. "I want all of it. The revenge and the partnership and whatever this is between us." She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "But I have one condition." "Name it." "When we destroy them, Manton, Blackwood, Ashworth, we do it together. As equals. Not as Duke and Duchess, but as partners who trust each other with everything." Her fingers tightened on his. "No more secrets between us. No more masks in our own home." Adams Foster smiled, and it transformed his entire face from something hard and dangerous into something almost tender. "Agreed," he said. Then he bent his head and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was fierce and claiming and full of the kind of hunger that came from two people recognizing their mirror image. Sherry Irene kissed him back with everything she had, all her rage and defiance and newfound strength, and felt something inside her that had been frozen for years finally catch fire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adams rested his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we start the war. But tonight, we get to be just ourselves." Sherry Irene smiled against his mouth. "Then take me to bed, husband. And show me exactly who you are." Lord Thomas Ashworth made his first mistake when he invited the newly married Duke and Duchess of Foxworth to his country estate for a weekend shooting party. He made his second mistake when he assumed Adams was still the broken creature he pretended to be. And he made his final, fatal mistake when he underestimated Sherry Irene entirely. The party was small by Ashworth standards, only 30 guests, but carefully curated. Every man present had some connection to the War Office contracts that Ashworth, Manton, and Blackwood had been bleeding dry for 5 years. Every woman present was either a wife trained to see nothing or a mistress trained to hear everything. It was the kind of gathering where fortunes were discussed over cigars and treason was negotiated between courses. Sherry Irene played her role to perfection. The bitter young Duchess, married to an invalid, seeking sympathy and perhaps something more interesting from the gentlemen who whispered in corners. She wore gowns that were just slightly too fashionable, laughed just slightly too loud, and drank just enough champagne that people assumed she wasn't paying attention to anything important. She paid attention to everything. On the second night, she found herself alone in Ashworth's study with Lord Pemberton, a War Office clerk whose fondness for brandy exceeded his discretion. She'd maneuvered the conversation carefully, complaining about her husband's condition, hinting at financial difficulties, suggesting that perhaps someone might help a lady in unfortunate circumstances. Pemberton had been pathetically easy. Within 20 minutes he was boasting about the shipping contracts, about the arrangements that ensured certain vessels were always awarded to certain companies, about the kickbacks that flowed through Ashworth's estate like a river of gold. Your husband's father, God rest his soul, wouldn't cooperate, Pemberton slurred, his breath reeking of expensive cognac. Stubborn bastard. Refused to pay the facilitation fees. Thought he could run an honest shipping business in London. He laughed wetly. Look where that got him. Blown to pieces in some Russian factory. Sherry Irene's smile never wavered, though her fingers tightened on her champagne flute hard enough that she felt the crystal crack. How tragic, she murmured. And now those contracts go to Lord Ashworth's associates. Most of them. Blackwood handles the Mediterranean routes, Manton controls the Baltic trades. Beautiful system, really. Everyone profits except the Crown, and the Crown has too many contracts to audit them all. He leaned closer, his hand finding her knee. A clever woman could profit too, you know. If she knew the right people. If she had information worth selling. Information. Sherry Irene let her eyes go wide and innocent. What kind of information? About Foxworth, for instance. Whether the Duke is truly as broken as he seems. Whether the estate is vulnerable to new management. Whether his widow might be interested in more sympathetic companionship. She let him kiss her hand, let him think he was seducing her, let him believe she was just another desperate society wife looking for advantage. Then she excused herself, citing too much champagne, and went directly to the chamber where Adams was supposedly sleeping. He was at the desk instead, fully dressed, writing by candlelight. He looked up as she entered and saw her face. What happened? Pemberton just confessed to everything. The contracts, the kickbacks, the facilitation fees. He admitted your father was murdered for refusing to cooperate. She pulled off her gloves with shaking hands. And he propositioned me as a spy. Offered to pay me for information about you. Adams set down his pen very carefully. Did he touch you? My hand. Nothing more. She met his eyes. I let him think I was interested. I need you to know that was strategy, not. I know. He stood and crossed to her, cupping her face in both hands. I know exactly what you're doing, and you're magnificent. Did he give you anything we can use? Names. Amounts. Details about the contract system. She reached into her bodice and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I took notes in the retiring room. It's all here. Adams unfolded the paper and scanned her neat handwriting. His expression went cold and deadly. This is enough. Combined with the ledgers I've been keeping, this is more than enough to hang them all. He looked up at her. Are you ready to move? What do you need me to do? Tomorrow morning, I need you to have a very public, very theatrical breakdown. Scream at me. Throw things. Storm out and take the carriage back to London. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. Make everyone believe our marriage is fracturing. Make Ashworth think you're vulnerable and angry and ready to betray me. And then I'm going to have a private conversation with Lord Ashworth about his accounts. Adams smiled, and it was terrible to behold. A conversation where I'm going to reveal that I'm not nearly as broken as he thinks, and that I've spent the last 5 years documenting every single one of his illegal transactions. I'm going to offer him a choice: face public trial and certain execution for treason, or arrange his affairs privately and save his family the scandal. Sherry Irene understood immediately. You're going to make him kill himself. I'm going to give him the option to die with dignity instead of on the gallows. What he chooses is up to him." Adams's voice was utterly without mercy. "But either way, Lord Thomas Ashworth will be dead by Sunday, and the first pillar of their empire will have fallen." She should have been horrified. She should have been shocked. Instead, all she felt was a fierce, burning satisfaction. "Good," she said. "Let him burn." The next morning, Sherry Irene gave the performance of her lifetime. She screamed at Adams in front of 14 witnesses, called him a broken, useless creature, threw a vase that shattered against the wall inches from his wheelchair, and stormed out of Ashworth's estate in floods of angry tears. By the time her carriage reached London, the gossip would already be spreading. The Foxworth marriage was over. The Duchess was in revolt. She was halfway home when the first messenger reached her with Adams's coded note, "It's done." He chose the pistol. Lord Thomas Ashworth was found dead in his study that Sunday afternoon, a single bullet through his brain and a note expressing profound regret over financial difficulties. The scandal was enormous. His estate was immediately seized for audit. His associates at the War Office began distancing themselves as fast as propriety would allow. And in Foxworth House, Adams Foster and Sherry Irene Foster drank a toast to the first casualty in their war of revenge. 1 down. 2 to go. The audit began on a Tuesday morning when 3 Crown investigators arrived at Lord Manton's Grosvenor Square residence with warrants signed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer himself. Manton had been sipping his breakfast coffee when they walked into his dining room, and Sherry Irene, who'd positioned herself in the drawing room next door with Lady Manton, heard the porcelain cup shatter against marble with a sound like breaking bones. She kept her expression appropriately concerned as Lady Manton rushed to see what the commotion was about, but inside she was counting heartbeats. Adams had timed this perfectly. The Ashworth audit had exposed enough irregularities to trigger a broader investigation into War Office contracts, and Manton's name had appeared in Ashworth's papers exactly as many times as Adams had ensured it would. Not too many to seem planted, but enough to draw official scrutiny. "There must be some mistake," she heard Manton blustering from the dining room. "I'm an earl, for God's sake. You can't simply barge into my home. We have documentation suggesting irregularities in Mediterranean shipping contracts awarded between 1843 and 1847, my lord." The lead investigator's voice was professionally cold. "We'll need access to your account ledgers, correspondence relating to Foxworth shipping, and any records of payments made to or received from Lord Ashworth's estate." Sherry Irene rose smoothly and glided into the dining room as if drawn by concern rather than calculation. Manton's face had gone the color of old cheese, his jowls trembling with barely contained panic. He looked at her with something almost like hope. Here was the Foxworth woman, the bitter wife he'd been cultivating as an informant. Surely she could help him somehow. "Is everything quite all right?" she asked sweetly. Lady Manton seemed distressed. "This is a private matter," Manton snapped, but his eyes were desperate. "Perhaps you should. Actually, Your Grace, you might be able to assist us." The investigator turned to her with polite interest. "We understand your husband's father held shipping contracts that were subsequently transferred after his death. Were you aware of any communications between the late Duke of Foxworth and Lord Manton?" Sherry Irene let her expression turn thoughtful, as if she were genuinely trying to remember. In truth, she knew exactly what she was about to say because she and Adams had rehearsed this conversation 3 times over breakfast. "Now that you mention it, I did find something rather odd when I was going through my husband's papers. He keeps everything in such disarray, poor dear." She opened her reticule, the one she'd prepared specifically for this morning call, and withdrew a folded document. I thought this might be important, but I couldn't make sense of it. Something about facilitation fees. The investigator took the paper from her hands like it was made of gold. It was a copy of a letter from Manton to the late Duke of Foxworth, demanding a payment of £5,000 in exchange for favorable consideration of shipping contracts. The original was locked in Adams's safe. This copy was perfect down to Manton's seal and signature, authenticated by 3 separate handwriting experts who'd been paid handsomely for their discretion. "Where did you find this?" the investigator asked sharply. "In a portfolio my husband inherited from his father. I was organizing the study last week, trying to make sense of the estate finances, you understand, and this was mixed in with old correspondence." She glanced at Manton with wide, innocent eyes. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, Lord Manton. My father-in-law probably misinterpreted your letter." Manton's face had progressed from cheese-white to a dangerous purple. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly trying to calculate whether denying the letter would be worse than explaining it. The investigator was already scanning the contents, his expression growing harder with each line. "Lord Manton, I'm afraid we'll need you to accompany us to the Treasury office." The investigator folded the letter carefully and placed it in his case. "We have several questions about your business arrangements that require immediate clarification." "This is absurd. That document is obviously," Manton caught himself, but too late. He'd been about to say, forged, but that would require admitting he knew what it contained. "I demand to speak with my solicitor." "Of course, my lord. You may send for him from the Treasury." The investigators moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before, flanking Manton like prison guards. "Your Grace, thank you for your cooperation. We may need to call upon you for testimony." Sherry Irene curtsied gracefully. "Anything to help His Majesty's government, sir." She stayed for exactly 10 more minutes, comforting the hysterical Lady Manton with soothing platitudes about misunderstandings and legal mistakes, before excusing herself and climbing into her carriage. The moment the door closed and the horses started moving, she let herself smile. Adams was waiting for her in the study when she arrived home, standing by the window in his shirt sleeves, watching the street. He turned as she entered, and she saw the same fierce satisfaction in his eyes that was burning in her chest. "They took him," she said. "I know. I had someone watching." He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. "The letter?" "Accepted without question." The investigator looked like he wanted to kiss me. She laughed against his chest. "Lady Manton is probably burning half their correspondence right now, but it won't matter. We made copies of everything. Manton won't survive the audit." Adams's voice was quietly triumphant. "The shipping frauds alone are enough to ruin him. The payments to Ashworth will connect him to the murder plot. And your father's confession," he pulled back to look at her. "Are you ready to use it?" Sherry Irene thought of her father's shaking hand, his broken sob, the way he'd sold her like property to save his worthless skin. "I'm ready," she said. "Let him burn with Manton. They deserve each other." Adams kissed her forehead, gentle despite the violence of what they were doing. "2 down," he murmured. "1 to go." The window lock gave way with a soft click that sounded obscenely loud in the midnight silence. Sherry Irene held her breath, listening for any sign they'd been heard, but Blackwood's townhouse remained still as a tomb. Beside her, Adams moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent 5 years rebuilding his body into a weapon, swinging himself through the window and landing in a perfect crouch on the study floor. She followed, grateful for the practical men's breeches and dark coat she'd borrowed from Adams's wardrobe. The silk gowns of a duchess had no place in burglary. 10 minutes, Adams whispered, his breath warm against her ear. The safe is behind the portrait of his grandfather. I need you watching the door. Sherry Irene nodded and positioned herself where she could see both the study entrance and the hallway beyond. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands were steady as she gripped the letter opener she'd brought as a makeshift weapon. They discussed this plan for 3 weeks, waited for the perfect night when Blackwood would be at his club until dawn, bribed 2 servants for information about guard rotations and safe locations. Everything had to go perfectly. Adams was already at work on the portrait, lifting it carefully from its hooks and setting it against the desk. The safe behind it was newer than expected, German-made, with a complex lock that made him curse softly under his breath. How long? Sherry Irene asked. Longer than 10 minutes. His fingers moved across the dial with practiced precision, ear pressed to the metal, listening for the telltale clicks. The ledgers have to be in here. Blackwood's too paranoid to keep them anywhere else. That's when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Adams. Her voice was barely a breath, but he heard the warning in it. He straightened immediately, abandoning the safe, crossing to her side in 3 silent strides. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the door just as lamplight spilled into the hallway. Absolutely certain the window was open. Blackwood's voice, sharp with suspicion. Yes, Sir Reginald. The study window. I checked it myself before retiring. The footman sounded nervous. Sherry Irene felt Adams's hand find hers in the darkness, his fingers closing around hers in a grip that was both reassuring and warning. They'd planned for this contingency. If they were discovered, Adams would create a distraction while she escaped through the window. But as the lamplight grew brighter and Blackwood's footsteps approached the study door, she realized with cold certainty that there wouldn't be time for her to run. The door swung open. Lamplight flooded the room. Blackwood stood in the doorway, still dressed for the club in evening wear, his snake-cold eyes taking in the scene with predatory intelligence, the moved portrait, the exposed safe, and 2 figures pressed against his wall like cornered rats. Well, he said softly, setting the lamp on his desk. The crippled Duke. How remarkably mobile you've become. Adams didn't waste time on pretense. He stepped forward, putting himself between Blackwood and Sherry Irene, his posture shifting into something that made her think of loaded weapons. Send your footman away. I don't think so. Blackwood smiled, and it was the expression of a man who thought he'd already won. I think instead I'll have him fetch the magistrate. Breaking and entering. Attempted theft. Your little charade is over, Foxworth. You're going to hang. The footman, Adams repeated, and there was something in his voice that made even Blackwood hesitate. Send him away, or what happens next will require explanations you don't want to give. Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then waved dismissively at the servant hovering in the hallway. Wait downstairs. I'll call if I need you. The moment they were alone, Blackwood reached into his coat. Sherry Irene saw the flash of metal and shouted a warning, but Adams was already moving. He crossed the space between them faster than she'd ever seen him move, catching Blackwood's wrist mid-draw and twisting with brutal efficiency. The pistol clattered to the floor. Blackwood gasped in pain and tried to wrench free, but Adams held him effortlessly, 5 years of hidden strength finally unleashed. You killed my father, Adams said quietly, forcing Blackwood back against the desk. You and Ashworth and Manton. You arranged the explosion. You stole our contracts. You thought a crippled son couldn't touch you. You have no proof, Blackwood snarled, then cried out as Adams twisted his arm harder. "I have 5 years of proof. Ashworth's papers. Manton's ledgers. Your own correspondence, which I'm going to take from that safe whether you open it or not." Adams leaned closer, his voice dropping to something deadly. "But first, I'm going to make sure you understand what you created when you tried to break me. I spent 2 years learning to walk again. Every day in agony. Every night dreaming of this moment." He released Blackwood's arm and stepped back, giving him space. "So come on, then. Show me what a healthy man can do against a cripple." Blackwood lunged for the fallen pistol. Adams kicked it away with contemptuous ease, then drove his fist into Blackwood's jaw with enough force to send him sprawling across the carpet. Blackwood scrambled up, murder in his eyes, and threw himself at Adams in a tackle that should have worked against a man who'd spent 5 years in a wheelchair. It didn't. Adams sidestepped, caught Blackwood's momentum, and used it to slam him face first into the wall beside the safe. The impact was sickeningly solid. Blackwood slid to the floor, blood streaming from his broken nose, and Adams stood over him like an avenging angel. "Open the safe," Adams said. "Or I'll break every bone in your writing hand and you'll open it anyway." Blackwood opened the safe. 20 minutes later, they climbed back through the window with 3 leather-bound ledgers that documented every illegal transaction Blackwood had made in the Mediterranean routes. Behind them, Sir Reginald Blackwood sat slumped against his desk, nursing his broken nose and shattered pride, knowing that if he reported this break-in he'd have to explain what was stolen. And those ledgers would hang him just as surely as they'd hang Manton. In the carriage racing back toward Foxworth House, Sherry Irene finally let herself laugh, wild and slightly hysterical with leftover fear and triumph. Adams pulled her against his side, his knuckles still bleeding from where they'd connected with Blackwood's face. "3 down," she whispered against his chest. "3 down," he agreed. "It's over." But they both knew it wasn't. Not quite yet. There was still one more reckoning to come. The Pemberton Christmas Ball was the event of the season, held in a ballroom that dripped with enough gold leaf and crystal to fund a small war. Every member of the ton who mattered had received an invitation, and every single one of them had accepted because they couldn't bear to miss the spectacle of the Foxworth marriage's continued deterioration. The gossip had been delicious all autumn, the Duchess seen arguing with tradesmen, the Duke reportedly declining into complete invalidity, whispers of separate households and imminent annulment. They had no idea what was actually coming. Sherry Irene arrived fashionably late in a gown of deep emerald silk that had cost more than most families earned in a year. She'd chosen it specifically because it made her look like a weapon, all sharp edges and dangerous beauty. Her hair was piled high, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists, the picture of a duchess who'd learned to enjoy her position despite her unfortunate marriage. Lady Pemberton descended on her immediately, sympathy dripping from every word like poison from a snake's fang. "My dear Duchess, how brave of you to attend alone. Is the Duke indisposed?" Sherry Irene said with a brittle smile. "You know how he gets during the winter months. The cold affects his condition so terribly." The surrounding vultures made appropriately sympathetic noises while their eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Poor girl. Trapped with that creature. What a waste. She accepted a glass of champagne and drifted through the crowd, letting them think she was drowning her sorrows in drink and desperate socializing. In reality, she was watching the clock above the orchestra and counting down minutes. Adams had said midnight. Midnight exactly, when the ballroom would be at its fullest and every important member of society would be present to witness. Lord Manton wasn't there, of course. He was awaiting trial for fraud and conspiracy, his reputation destroyed, his fortune seized. Blackwood had fled to France 2 weeks ago, one step ahead of arrest warrants. Lord Ashworth was 6 months in his grave. Their empire had crumbled exactly as Adams had promised it would, and the Ton was still reeling from the scandals that had torn through their ranks like wildfire. But they didn't yet know the full truth. They didn't know who had orchestrated their downfall. They still believed Adams Foster was a broken invalid who'd gotten lucky when his enemies destroyed themselves. At 5 minutes to midnight, Sherry Irene positioned herself near the center of the ballroom and waited. The clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The ballroom doors opened. Adams Foster walked through them. Not wheeled. Not carried. Not supported. Walked, with the confident stride of a man who owned every inch of ground beneath his feet. He was dressed in formal black that fit him like a second skin, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of a body that 5 years of secret training had honed into something magnificent. His hair was swept back from that sharp, angular face, and his winter storm eyes swept across the ballroom with the focus of a predator surveying prey. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes froze halfway to lips. Someone's fan clattered to the floor in the suddenly deafening silence, and nobody moved to pick it up because every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the Duke of Foxworth, who was supposed to be crippled, broken, helpless. And who was walking toward his wife like a man who'd never been broken at all. Sherry Irene felt her breath catch despite knowing this was coming, despite having planned every moment of this reveal. Because the reality of Adams Foster in his full power, in front of 300 witnesses who'd pitted and dismissed him, was more devastating than she'd imagined. This was what a resurrection looked like. This was what revenge embodied. He stopped in front of her and bowed with perfect, formal precision. "Duchess," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "May I have this dance?" She curtsied, fighting to keep the fierce smile off her face. "Your Grace, I thought you couldn't." "Dance?" He straightened and offered his hand, and there was something absolutely feral in his smile. "I've been practicing." She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her onto the dance floor as the orchestra, after a moment of stunned hesitation, launched into a waltz. Adams's hand settled at her waist, warm and possessive, and he swept her into the first turn with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his childhood learning every dance the Ton required. "You killed my father," Adams said quietly, forcing Blackwood back against the desk. "You and Ashworth and Manton. You arranged the explosion. You stole our contracts. You thought a crippled son couldn't touch you. You have no proof," Blackwood snarled, then cried out as Adams twisted his arm harder. "I have 5 years of proof. Ashworth's papers. Manton's ledgers. Your own correspondence, which I'm going to take from that safe whether you open it or not." Adams leaned closer, his voice dropping to something deadly. "But first, I'm going to make sure you understand what you created when you tried to break me. I spent 2 years learning to walk again. Every day in agony. Every night dreaming of this moment." He released Blackwood's arm and stepped back, giving him space. "So come on, then. Show me what a healthy man can do against a cripple." Blackwood lunged for the fallen pistol. Adams kicked it away with contemptuous ease, then drove his fist into Blackwood's jaw with enough force to send him sprawling across the carpet. Blackwood scrambled up, murder in his eyes, and threw himself at Adams in a tackle that should have worked against a man who'd spent 5 years in a wheelchair. It didn't. Adams sidestepped, caught Blackwood's momentum, and used it to slam him face first into the wall beside the safe. The impact was sickeningly solid. Blackwood slid to the floor, blood streaming from his broken nose, and Adams stood over him like an avenging angel. "Open the safe," Adams said. "Or I'll break every bone in your writing hand and you'll open it anyway." Blackwood opened the safe. 20 minutes later, they climbed back through the window with 3 leather-bound ledgers that documented every illegal transaction Blackwood had made in the Mediterranean routes. Behind them, Sir Reginald Blackwood sat slumped against his desk, nursing his broken nose and shattered pride, knowing that if he reported this break-in he'd have to explain what was stolen. And those ledgers would hang him just as surely as they'd hang Manton. In the carriage racing back toward Foxworth House, Sherry Irene finally let herself laugh, wild and slightly hysterical with leftover fear and triumph. Adams pulled her against his side, his knuckles still bleeding from where they'd connected with Blackwood's face. "3 down," she whispered against his chest. "3 down," he agreed. "It's over." But they both knew it wasn't. Not quite yet. There was still one more reckoning to come. The Pemberton Christmas Ball was the event of the season, held in a ballroom that dripped with enough gold leaf and crystal to fund a small war. Every member of the ton who mattered had received an invitation, and every single one of them had accepted because they couldn't bear to miss the spectacle of the Foxworth marriage's continued deterioration. The gossip had been delicious all autumn, the Duchess seen arguing with tradesmen, the Duke reportedly declining into complete invalidity, whispers of separate households and imminent annulment. They had no idea what was actually coming. Sherry Irene arrived fashionably late in a gown of deep emerald silk that had cost more than most families earned in a year. She'd chosen it specifically because it made her look like a weapon, all sharp edges and dangerous beauty. Her hair was piled high, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists, the picture of a duchess who'd learned to enjoy her position despite her unfortunate marriage. Lady Pemberton descended on her immediately, sympathy dripping from every word like poison from a snake's fang. "My dear Duchess, how brave of you to attend alone. Is the Duke indisposed?" Sherry Irene said with a brittle smile. "You know how he gets during the winter months. The cold affects his condition so terribly." The surrounding vultures made appropriately sympathetic noises while their eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Poor girl. Trapped with that creature. What a waste. She accepted a glass of champagne and drifted through the crowd, letting them think she was drowning her sorrows in drink and desperate socializing. In reality, she was watching the clock above the orchestra and counting down minutes. Adams had said midnight. Midnight exactly, when the ballroom would be at its fullest and every important member of society would be present to witness. Lord Manton wasn't there, of course. He was awaiting trial for fraud and conspiracy, his reputation destroyed, his fortune seized. Blackwood had fled to France 2 weeks ago, one step ahead of arrest warrants. Lord Ashworth was 6 months in his grave. Their empire had crumbled exactly as Adams had promised it would, and the ton was still reeling from the scandals that had torn through their ranks like wildfire. But they didn't yet know the full truth. They didn't know who had orchestrated their downfall. They still believed Adams Foster was a broken invalid who'd gotten lucky when his enemies destroyed themselves. At 5 minutes to midnight, Sherry Irene positioned herself near the center of the ballroom and waited. The clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The ballroom doors opened. Adams Foster walked through them. Not wheeled. Not carried. Not supported. Walked, with the confident stride of a man who owned every inch of ground beneath his feet. He was dressed in formal black that fit him like a second skin, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of a body that 5 years of secret training had honed into something magnificent. His hair was swept back from that sharp, angular face, and his winter storm eyes swept across the ballroom with the focus of a predator surveying prey. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes froze halfway to lips. Someone's fan clattered to the floor in the suddenly deafening silence, and nobody moved to pick it up because every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the Duke of Foxworth, who was supposed to be crippled, broken, helpless. And who was walking toward his wife like a man who'd never been broken at all. Sherry Irene felt her breath catch despite knowing this was coming, despite having planned every moment of this reveal. Because the reality of Adams Foster in his full power, in front of 300 witnesses who'd pitted and dismissed him, was more devastating than she'd imagined. This was what a resurrection looked like. This was what revenge embodied. He stopped in front of her and bowed with perfect, formal precision. "Duchess," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "May I have this dance?" She curtsied, fighting to keep the fierce smile off her face. "Your Grace, I thought you couldn't dance." He straightened and offered his hand, and there was something absolutely feral in his smile. "I've been practicing." She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her onto the dance floor as the orchestra, after a moment of stunned hesitation, launched into a waltz. Adams's hand settled at her waist, warm and possessive, and he swept her into the first turn with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his childhood learning every dance the ton required.
Thank you so much for watching. Your support truly means everything to me. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It only takes a second but helps immensely in bringing you more content like this. I've got another compelling video ready for you. Just click on it now to continue. See you in the next one.